You're listening to Inside the Village, where all news is local and no topic is off limits.
So help me, Bob, it's bully in the alley. Hey, bully in the alley. So help me, Bob.
This is Inside the Village. It's Friday, December the 8th, 2023. I'm Scott Sexsmith with Michael Friscoletti, Editor-in-Chief. Here at Village Media, Derek Turner, Executive Producer, is in the room. It's a Friday. The weekend is here. Some big news that came out last week regarding Google.
Big news for the news.
Big news for the news.
Yeah.
And I'm convinced that their $100 million check had something to do with your discussion with Justin Trudeau.
That was the deal breaker,
Well,
right? Yeah, it was so widely viewed and went viral that
that's what sealed the deal.
it sealed the deal. Yeah. So as everybody saw, the Heritage Minister announced a $100 million deal with Google regarding the Online News Act. It's a complicated issue. We've talked about it a lot on this show.
Yes.
But this is the government passed the law, basically forcing big tech to compensate media outlets for the content they steal and put on their platforms.
Yeah.
It wasn't something that we had supported from the beginning. We're a digital-only company, digital first. We had our own benefits from working with Google and Facebook to get our content out there.
Totally did.
And this kind of legislated those relationships. And as we've all seen, Facebook has vanished. They're not in the news business anymore. They don't, or you can't find our sites or any other journalism sites on Facebook. Google was threatening to do the same. They came to this deal. I think originally the government had said that Google would have to pay upwards of $162 million a year to Canadian news organizations, and they settled on $1 million, which is a lot lower. The reality is, this legislation still stinks. It doesn't do a lot. It's not good for us. It's better that Google didn't walk away from the table, but it's certainly not something that we're jumping up and down and celebrating, but something, I guess.
It is something. And I don't know what our cut may be of that $100 million, but I'm going to suggest if we do get some, we buy you a new laptop. It is crazy how that thing...
Can you hear that thing?
I can hear it. I can hear it in here.
Is it making a noise in the microphones too?
That's okay.
Showing up on the show.
No,
this thing's going to blow up. I don't think it's been turned off in a year and a half.
Anyway, if we get any money, the first $1,000, if we get that much, goes right there. New laptop for Frisco.
For sure.
Okay. Normally on the show we talk about the first word to Frisco, where we highlight 2 or 3 or 4 great stories that have been covered across our footprint in the past week. But recently, and this may be somewhat self-indulgent, but I think that's okay. Our entire editorial team fared out just marvelously when it comes to nominations with the Canadian Online Publishing Awards, and it's just fantastic.
Yeah, it was a great year for us. We certainly don't do this job to win awards or get nominated for awards, but it's always nice because I always say I sound like a broken record, and I sound like a broken record when I say I sound like a broken record. But I do. I think we do great work. I tell our team every week that we're in our communities and telling the stories that matter, that people need to know about. And getting nominations like this is just kind of a nod that we are doing that kind of work. So I want to give a shout out to everybody individually who was nominated. Checking my notes here because it's such a long list, Scott.
Yes.
Our journalists in Simcoe were nominated multiple times for their coverage of the tragic shooting deaths of 2 South Simcoe police officers last year. Something that you covered with the reporters at the time. They came on for behind-the-scenes segments,
right.
And we talked about it on the show, at least in one episode we did. Natasha Philpott and Rob Paul, at the time working for Innisfil Today, were nominated twice for their coverage. Once for Best Daily News and Sports in the Daily News and Sports category, and once for Best Local Community News coverage. They were on the scene then on that terrible night. I remember that well, and continued to cover the aftermath in the days to come. I kind of knew they were leading the way at the time. Their coverage was fantastic, and it's just kind of, like I said, is confirmation of that.
Yeah.
The same story, our team in Barrie Today, editor Raymond Bowe, reporters Nikki Cole, Sean Gibson, and Kevin Lamb, were also not recognized for their daily news coverage of those police shootings and the aftermath. Just a fantastic team effort from the crew in Barrie. And on top of that, Kevin Lamb was also nominated in the Best Photojournalism category for his coverage of the funeral. If you remember the gallery from that day, it was just very powerful photojournalism.
Certainly was.
There's just so many officers and so many people lining the streets on their way into Saddleton Arena for that event. So obviously a great nomination for him. It's well-deserved. It was a very powerful photojournalism. On a much happier note, a member of our team, Midland Today editor Andrew Phillips, was nominated for Best Feel-Good Story of the Year. don't know if anybody remembers this. I don't remember if we mentioned this on the show. This was the tale of Alice the Rooster's guardian angel. Basically, Andrew told the story of this local woman's fundraising efforts to save a sick rooster at Ralphie's Retreat Animal Sanctuary, which provides a long-term home for abused, neglected, and abandoned farm animals. It was really a heartwarming story, and more proof that, you know, local journalism comes in all forms, right? You have very serious, tragic events, and then you have roosters, which is, you know, it's
for some reason, you know what I was just thinking of Stanley the Goat.
It's what we do, and you know, fittingly enough, Dave Dawson, who's our regional editor in Simcoe, who oversees all these sites, often says that our sites are like a photo album, right? You flip through it, and you see all kinds of different photos in there, and this is a great example of that. Finally, James Hopkin here at Sioux Today was nominated for Best Daily News Coverage for a scoop about Gen 7 fuels being the target of a multi-million-dollar lawsuit. You remember this story?
Yes, very well.
This is a court action which is still ongoing, which claims that the married couple in charge of this company, who are not Indigenous, used stolen funds to build this chain of First Nations gas stations and fund a lavish lifestyle, which we all remember included this multi-million-dollar yacht, which was at the center of this lawsuit. Yep. So James broke that story. James Hopkin was a super scoop, and we knew it was because the next day the Globe and Mail followed our coverage, which is pretty great. When the Globe is following some of our local coverage is a real testament to the work we're doing. So a huge congrats to everybody involved, and a huge congratulations just to our team in general. Village Media is here and doing amazing work, and more people are noticing every day. Yeah,
you've got a great team. There's no question about that. And I think back to that tragedy in Barrie with the shooting of the police officers, and a comment that Peter Leon from the Barrie Police Service made to us off air when we were getting set to tape an episode of the show, in fact, was how much he enjoyed dealing with the Village Media staff, not just with that tragedy, but with, you know, police releases in general in that area, and how professional and courteous and how good those reporters are at doing what they do.
Super professional, right? They know how to ask the tough questions at the same time, right? Yeah. They're respectful, they do their job well, but they ask the tough questions in that community, as we do all over. Yep. So yeah, it's great. I mean, there are journalism awards every year for different things, and we don't put huge stock in it. We don't spend every day thinking about how we're going to get nominated for an award, but it is nice when we do, because it's good for our communities to know that the work that our local journalists are doing is being recognized.
No question. As the saying goes, it's an honor just to be nominated.
That's right.
Now that doesn't mean that we still don't want to win, but you know.
Yeah, and for just to note, we weren't anywhere near the best podcast category, so we have some work to do.
We do. Every day we try and get a little bit better, but clearly we're not there yet. Okay, today on the show, Professor Dan Malleck from Brock University. Dan is a prof of health sciences at Brock, and we're going to talk about alcohol sales and how that there could be a seismic shift in the province in the next little while in terms of where we buy it.
It's a good day when it's a Friday and we can talk about beer on the show. So thank goodness.
All right, Dan Malleck from Brock University joins us next when Inside the Village returns right after this.
Reporters, editors, and journalists who go the extra mile to get the story and get it right. Go behind the scenes with those who cover the stories that matter most to you and your community. Look for it in the Village Features section of your favorite Village Media website across Ontario.
Welcome back to Inside the Village. I'm Scott Sexsmith alongside Village Media Editor-in-Chief Michael Friscolanti. On the line with us today is Professor Dan Malleck. He's the Professor of Health Sciences at Brock University. Professor, welcome to Inside the Village. Great to have you here today.
I'm glad to be here. Thanks for the invitation.
I have to say, out of all of the episodes that we've done, and there have been dozens, out of all the bio pictures that we have seen, we have never seen a guest with a bio picture leaning up against a bar. So I think we'll get along just fine.
Yeah. Sadly, that's an old one now. So
it's a great shot.
It's an oldie but a goodie.
It's a memorable one. Yes. Well, thanks, Professor, for joining us. We want to talk about a few different issues today, but the beer store is one that's on a lot of people's minds. And you're hoping you can just bring us up to speed. The provincial government's been talking about preparing to change the laws for how beer, wine, and spirits are distributed in Ontario. Can you just kind of bring us up to speed on where we stand on that, where we're at?
Yeah, well, I mean, there's a lot of speculation still. As everyone probably remembers, when the current premier, I think before he became premier, he was saying he wanted to see beer in corner stores. But a few years before he was elected, the previous government had signed a 10-year agreement called, I think, the Master Framework Agreement with the beer store. And that restructured the relationship with the beer store. And it was one of those moments, interesting moments, when people didn't actually realize the beer store was not a provincial agency like the LCBO is. And so it was formed as a cooperative back in the 1920s when Prohibition ended, a cooperative of all the breweries that existed at the time. And there were more than 3 big ones and a bunch of small ones. But over time, it became basically run by the 3 big ones, Labatt's, which is AB InBev, and Molson Coors, and Sapporo, which owns Sleeman. So, and a bunch of other breweries. So, the concern at the time was that, especially from the rapidly growing and expanding craft beer industry, that there just they weren't getting the same shake. Like it was really skewed towards the big 3. And so the Master Framework Agreement, and also there was this ongoing lingering concern that, how come it's so hard to get your hands on beer? So I think there was some lobbying from the supermarkets in that. So that's when we got beer in supermarkets and wine as well. And we had some wine. That's a whole different sort of structure. But the Master Framework Agreement with the beer store had all of these requirements around how much, like the quantities that could be sold in supermarkets, as far as like the packaging, 6 packs, I think, was the maximum, and where it could go, how close it could be to beer stores, and then actually doing things like assessing if beer store sales plummet, maybe that would reconsider the license at some supermarkets, which was, I don't think that's ever happened. And I think we have something like 450 supermarket licenses now. The odds of it being close to a beer store is pretty high. And so it was that sort of thing. It was also gave craft brewers, I think, a seat at the table on the boards, and it promised a certain amount of craft beer in the beer stores and in the supermarkets as well, or I'd say supermarkets in the retailers, because there are places that are not specifically supermarkets that have them. So that was the framework. But one of the elements of the Master Framework Agreement was that if the province wanted to cancel it, they had to give the beer store 3 years notice, and we are now 3 years out from the end of that first 10 years. And so the premier, who had wanted beer, which is interesting, he's not himself a drinker, my understanding is, but he really wants to see beer in the corner stores. It's at the point where they have to notify the beer store corporation that they're going to either renegotiate or change it. So is that up to speed?
Yes.
Yeah, no, that's fantastic. Professor, speaking of the beer store, you've described it as a relic of the immediate post-Prohibition era. Can you kind of tell us what you meant by that?
Yeah, sure. So at the end of when Prohibition ended in Ontario, because Prohibition in Canada was provincial, for some reason, and I've studied the LCBO a lot, but I could never kind of get my head around what happened with the beer store. They allowed beer to be sold by the brewers, and the brewers formed this cooperative. And I think it was the same year that the LCBO was formed, 1927. It could have been 1928, a new sort of some legislation passed there. So it created this brewers warehousing corporation. And so it's, I say a relic. It's not a relic as in denigrating it, but it is a something that came from the end of Prohibition. It's unique in Ontario. I mean, it's unique in Canada. I don't think there's another beer store situation like we have in Ontario, and I'm pretty sure it's unique across North America in the sense that there is this privately owned beer store corporation, like as a collective of all the breweries. So in other provinces and states, if you say, yeah, I'm going to the beer store, they might think it's just a store where beer is sold, which is true, but here it's literally run by the brewers as their sort of their interest there.
From all the research you do you feel that the government's going to give them that 3-year notice and that we're going to move on to a post-beer store light?
It's tough to say. I mean, the interesting thing about the current government is that they have done some things really quickly and upfront, and then some things that just sort of much more subtly. So I use the example of what happened at the end of, when cannabis was legalized, and how initially we have very few cannabis shops, and then in the last 2 or 3 years we've seen them opening everywhere around the province, and that. If we remember early on, there was just a few licenses distributed. It was kind of a lottery, right? Whether someone got a license. And then somehow during the pandemic, or after, just like the timing was about the same time, these licenses expanded. So sometimes they do things very openly and clearly, and sometimes not. But when it comes to the 3-year notice, they're definitely going to have to go through with it, because otherwise they would be sued by the beer store if they didn't follow that process. And the process is fairly clear, and it may be that they want to renegotiate it, right? It may not be that they're just going to cancel it, but it seems that it's a government that's very focused on affordability right now, and so the idea that taking beer out of the hands of this big company and putting it in corner stores might seem to be an affordability issue as well. Corner stores tend to be more expensive than everyday grocery stores and that, so that could be part of their angle. It's definitely a populist move, and there's a lot of argument just to say, why do we have this one point of purchase when you could open it up to the market and have different types of beer stores opening all over, right? Like some specialist craft beer stores and some places that really still sell a lot of the big three and stuff like that.
How's that going to work, though, Professor, when it comes to opening it up the way that you allude to, yet still protecting the coffers of the LCBO?
Well, that's a really good question. I mean, the LCBO does sell beer, obviously, but it may be that the LCBO is one of many retailers of beer. People still go there for spirits and wine. One of the models, there are a bunch of models across the province, across the country that could be followed. We go look at, say, in Quebec, where beer and wine is basically sold at a private retail companies, but spirits are still sold in the SAQ. In BC, they kind of have a parallel system where there's the BC Liquors store that has beer and wine and spirits, and then people can get licenses for their own private stores, and they kind of run sort of in competition, but not supposed to be in competition. And then in Alberta, it's pretty much a wide open market. They got rid of the Alberta liquor stores and have them private, and then just various forms around there. So I don't know if it will be protecting the coffers of the LCBO. The LCBO, I don't think there's been any discussion about opening up spirits to private retailing, and they haven't said a lot about wine either. So I'm not quite sure how that will unfold.
Professor, the other issue for me is I think the one thing that really does work well with the beer store is the recycling program, right? I think it's like 99.9. Oh, do you have the same question?
I just wrote down empties. Where are the empties going?
We're all thinking the same thing, right? And I do know that I think it's like 99.9% of all beer containers are returned because of the way the system works. How would it work without the beer store doing that? How that could have some implications?
That is one of the big things that the beer store marketed their resistance, I guess, to the last when they were going through the negotiations the last time. And that is definitely part of the master framework agreement. But we've and so the short answer to that is I don't know. But if we want to speculate a bit, we can, or just look at some of the nuances of it. Like the recycling in this province is not entirely in the hands of one store. Right? The empties are, but there also, we used to have a refund system through glass bottles and things like that, right? So there are different models on how to do this. And with the new rules around recycling being the responsibility of the companies who generate the waste or the packaging in that, it could be that this is a time to also look at the beer empties or the booze empties. But the difference being that, we have a massive amounts of cans and bottles that have have a deposit on them and things like that. So yeah, that is definitely something that the beer store hung on to, but held up as part of the social benefit of having the beer store. And that is something that will have to be considered, whether it's like, grocery stores don't really have the capacity to do that, even though that's where we used to take our empties, like our empty bottles and milk bottles and pop bottles and stuff like that. So there are other models for this, or that's going to be a sticking point for sure.
Because if there is no way to deal with the empties and that becomes an additional cost to the province, of course, that cost is going to translate to a taxation to all of us, right? Mm-hmm. Is that not how that would work?
Well, it could if, that's the challenge of the new recycling model is that it wouldn't necessarily be a tax, but it would be if you're going to require companies to do to manage the recycling, the companies are going to pass that price on to the consumer, whether it's a tax or whether it's an increase in price. And we're in an affordability crisis right now, right? Mm-hmm. But this is unique because right now we have that deposit. So would it be that one way to do this is to open it up to the market, but to have a carved out special place for the beer store within that, right? Which is kind of what they tried to do with the master framework agreement, but it might just be about more because you're not going to see a lot of 2-4s in corner stores. Just they don't have the size for it, right? Yeah. So it could be that the beer stores remain, but they have competition now, and that in that point, bringing the empties to the beer store might actually be kind of a loss leader for the beer store, because people are going to come in and often you bring your empties back and they say you're going to buy more or just take the money. Yeah. So it could be it's going to be, you guys are touching on some of the really complex issues of this, which is just, I wouldn't want to be, I actually would love to be in the room talking about this in the government, but I certainly wouldn't want to be the decision maker deciding how this is going to work in a seamless way.
So it'll be great if you're actually in this room with us, because we could go for a beer. We could go for a beer after we're done, and we could keep talking about it, make sure we recycle it
and
properly.
then bring our empties back.
Bring the empties back.
Get some more.
Exactly. From a business perspective, Professor, how much of a game changer would it be for the many craft breweries in Ontario if the beer store was phased out? I mean, they must lobby and say that this would be a huge thing for us, a huge win.
Well, it could be. I mean, the thing is that just like the other discussions we've had, where else do they sell them, right? So here in St. Catharines, we've got a few shops that are kind of restaurants, but really they've become bottle shops through the changes that were made during the pandemic. So whether they're craft or the big brewers, where do you sell it, right? They can't just sell it at the brewery location, because that really limits your options. You can definitely continue to sell in the supermarket or the LCBO, and there's costs to that. So I don't know if it's a win, I think, for craft brewers, because they're kind of breaking the retail hold of the big three. But you'd have to talk to the craft brewers to say whether or not that master framework agreement really worked for them. And I just don't know. I mean, I know that the other issue we've had in the last few years is because of the pandemic, more brewers have opened up to shipping. I forgot to put in my order today, but to shipping stuff to people's homes. So there's that element as well. And maybe it would strengthen the LCBO, or maybe the craft brewers would get together and create sort of a network of cooperative retail stores. I mean, there's that option as well. And they tend to talk to each other, but they are in competition with each other too. So I don't know the answer to that.
It is fascinating. Can I completely switch gears for a minute, Professor? Sorry. So
sure, you can.
But yeah, thank you. You're obviously an expert in drug and alcohol regulation and prohibition. This is your specialty. And one of the issues we talk about all the time, obviously, is the opioid crisis in this country. In our community, we're here. And we hear often terms like safe supply and safe consumption sites and things like that. Is this an issue that you've studied closely, and sort of in terms of, because we're not winning the battle by prohibiting people, like criminalizing these substances? What's the way forward, do you think? That's a totally big, huge question. But what do we need to be looking at closely in terms of that angle of this issue?
Yeah, wow, that's quite a turn. Sure. So a lot of people are saying, and I agree that prohibition has been a failure. When we saw drug prohibition starting in 1908, it really started before that, but it was national in 1908. The demographics of drug users was different, but over time drugs were added. The whole idea of taking something for recreational purposes apart from beer and maybe cigarettes for a while was problematic, and so then we have this, but people kind of like to do it, right? So there's a market for it, and when you have something that's prohibited but there's still a market for it, you have people move into that market. That is how markets work. So now we have a system where a lot of, and we saw this with, again, we go back to cannabis. The whole point of cannabis legalization, not just decriminalization, but legalization, was to remove it from the hands of the black market. Wasn't entirely successful, but we're still, well, this is 8 years, right, since Trudeau won on that promise, and what, about 6 years since legalization actually happened. So one solution is legalization, right? Legalize and control, like we have controlled alcohol and we have controlled cannabis. What that would do was make it less lucrative to sell illegal products, and there would be a system of managing the products, right? So one of the big problems we hear, we hear the term an opioid crisis or an addiction, like people who die from addiction or like an overdose, but it's actually the toxic drug supply. It's drugs that are not, that are containing things you don't know, right? So it's like if I wanted to have, if I had a pound of flour and half of it was sawdust, that would be a problem. And we have a system of analyzing and regulating that. And the reason I mentioned flour and sawdust is because it was one of the first things that the Food and Drug analyzers back 150 years ago were looking at, right? So we could have that kind of system. It's a huge political gamble, and there's a lot of problems about addiction and things like that. So then the next, I think I may have gotten away from your question, but so that's the biggest or the most contentious solution, and it may, and a lot of people say, well, there's a lot of issues with addiction and things like that need to be addressed along the way. So
it was a total 180 shift, and to ask you such a loaded question, but you're right. The idea of legalizing or not prohibiting these drugs would at least help us in the sense of being able to know what these drugs are. If you had a supply that was safe, it would arguably lower the overdose rates we're seeing in the last few years.
And the other, would probably lower the deaths, right? Whether they're from overdose or just like taking stuff you don't know what's in it. It would also help destigmatize, and when you destigmatize something like this, it's a little easier to talk about. I mean, even there's still a big stigma around alcoholism, so it wouldn't completely remove, and alcohol is legal, so it wouldn't completely remove that stigma, but it would at least open doors for people to talk about it with people, or to not end up in prison where there's a whole different situation instead of maybe looking for care or looking for help, or just if they can maintain their addiction, just maintaining it, right? But that's something that we have to get to the point where this notion that, is it okay for someone to be addicted to something and just maintain themselves? And that's in the current environment, it's not, because their access to those substances is engaging with a criminal network. But like 150 years ago, we had people who were what we call functional addicts to cocaine and to heroin. Well, not 150 years ago with heroin, because it's not that old, but to morphine, and they just got on with their lives, right? But it was when it became, when the addiction got too much, or when it became too, and they were usually did it in secret still, that it really became a problem when they had to engage with those like they had to do things in the shadows, so to speak.
I can't say it any better than you just did there, Professor, so I won't try to ask a question. You nailed it exactly the way I understand it. Because what we see, there's a lot of stigma with opioids and what's happening here. And part of it is because there are functioning addicts who have good jobs, who go to work every day. And we see, and often you'll hear about people who die of toxic drugs, and sometimes they are people who dealt with homelessness, or they're on the rough edge of society. But oftentimes it's also people who have good paying jobs, and they just got a bad supply.
No question.
And what was in it was what killed them. So it's a great, and I don't know if society's ready to have that discussion about whether we're willing to accept that. But I certainly appreciate that answer, Professor. Thank you.
And there are some advocates who call themselves public health advocates, for example, who find that a terrible idea, right? So there would be a significant push against it. And one of the things to mention between the difference between the overdose death and toxic drug supply is when you talk about overdose, it's focusing back on the individual, like it's their fault that they overdosed, whereas a toxic drug supply is like it's not their fault. It's a problem with the supply and a problem with the system that creates this environment for a toxic supply to exist.
Absolutely.
Just thinking about safe consumption sites, and it's certainly been in the news, Professor, in one of the markets that we're in is Sudbury, and they have a safe consumption site there called The Spot. Over 2 years ago, applied for funding from the province. Crickets, they've heard nothing. Their funding expires at the end of this month, and now you've got private companies within that city stepping up, at least for the month of January, to the tune of $75,000 to fund them, because they see the importance, not the stigma, but the importance of a safe consumption site. Any comment on that?
Yeah, I don't know the Sudbury situation specifically, but definitely safe consumption sites have been one of these political challenges, because it looks like you're facilitating something that a lot of people just see to be something governments shouldn't be encouraging.
Exactly.
Right? So there's a difference between health, like it's what we call harm reduction, right? So it's a difference between all of the harms associated with taking this drug, be it a toxic supply or dirty needles. I mean, safe injection sites started because of the concern over transmission of HIV and hepatitis C through dirty needles, right? Because that was a harm. That was a worse harm than just being addicted. And it's expanded to looking at all these other harms. And now we have the toxic drug crisis, which is a further concern. So people who can consume their intoxicant of choice while having access to health professionals if they want them, it's a really good idea from a public health perspective, and from I think a humane perspective. But when a government just sees that as not their part of their mandate, then we're going to hear crickets. Yeah, so it's great. But then at the same time, amongst addiction professionals and addiction physicians, for example, there's a lot of debate over this as well, over whether this is creating a situation where people can then take the drugs and sell them again or inject them in different ways. And there's all of these other elements that kind of really make it an extremely complicated situation.
Yep, no question. This has been an important discussion. Professor Dan Malleck from Brock University, Professor of Health Sciences there. Thanks for doing this. Have a great weekend. We appreciate your time today.
Absolutely, my pleasure. Thanks for the invitation. Take care.
For the latest in in-depth features and enterprise journalism from your local writers at Village Media, be sure to check out The Big Read. The Big Read, it's the full story behind the headlines. Look for The Big Read on your favorite Village Media website across Ontario.
Back to wrap on another episode of Inside the Village with Derek Turner, Michael Friscolanti, Editor-in-Chief here at Village Media. I'm Scott Sexsmith. I could sit and have those kinds of deep, meaningful discussions all day long. Dan was great.
Yeah, I think that's really the joy of this show, right? And where it really works well is when we have a guest like that on who can talk about an issue, multiple issues, and in a real intelligent, thoughtful way, right? It's not just about the clip or the soundbite or that one quote in a news story. It's about having a conversation. And I learned some things, so I'm hoping that our listeners learn some things too.
All right. Speaking of learning some things, hard to believe that the second season of Inside the Village is just about to wrap up. Next week, I'm excited. I know Derek's excited about it because he's putting it together. Part 1 of our year in review, the year that was 2023.
It's funny, we had a meeting about it the other day, and we were looking at the titles or the headlines of all the ones we've done, and it's crazy, like the wide variety. You talk about photo album and how it's
right.
So the podcast is like that as well. There's been all kinds of different variations of different stories, from the super serious to kind of funny, and on the lighter side, and it's great to go through it, and you know, it's something. You know, it's kind of lame to say. It's something to be proud of. It is. It's been a good run.
It certainly has. All right, that's next week, and that will be followed by part 2 of the year ender, as Frisco said, kind of the lighter side of some of the stuff that we do here. All right, itv@villagemedia.ca if you want to reach out. In the meantime, enjoy your weekend. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next week on Inside the Village.
You've been listening to Inside the Village.
Frisco and Scott's Wardrobe, provided in part by Moores, Sault Ste. Marie.